Hello, everybody. Lee here. I just wanted to give a quick content warning for this episode. It includes a brief discussion of cannibalism towards the end of the interview, and while the conversation is not graphic, the topic might be unsettling for some listeners. So please use discretion. Thank you, and on to the episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Midwestern Archaeology Podcast. My name is Lee Strange, and today on the show, we're joined by Dr. Sharyn Jones, professor of anthropology at Northern Kentucky University, whose work bridges archaeology, ethnography, and history to uncover how people, food, and environments shape one another across time and place. Dr. Jones has conducted fieldwork across the tropical Pacific Islands, India, Japan, and the Caribbean, but much of her research has focused on Fiji and Polynesia, where she has lived and worked closely with indigenous communities for more than 2 decades. Her scholarship explores how foodways, resource use, and social hierarchy both reflect and reinforce cultural values and ecological realities. Beyond her fieldwork, Dr. Jones is committed to public anthropology, striving to connect scholarship with real-world issues such as sustainability, gender, and heritage. Today, we are going to be discussing Dr. Jones' research on the foodways of the Pacific Islands, with particular focus on Fiji and Hawaii. So I'm curious, how did you first get involved in archaeology and anthropology? Was this always an interest of yours, or was there more of a journey to arrive at this?
Yeah, I'd say it was more of a journey. As an undergraduate, initially, I wasn't sure what I wanted to major in, but I was sort of leaning in towards pre-law, which is very funny to think about now. Like the world needs more lawyers, right? So I started taking general education courses, and I really didn't know much about anthropology, but I had a few courses in anthropology and just loved it. I loved cultural anthropology. I had a biological anthropology lab where we were handling primate skeletal material and things of that nature.
Mm.
And just, I loved it. So I immediately kind of shifted and thought about different career options and just stuck with that from that point on.
Did you have kind of an experience with like a field school or a specific professor that kind of turned you on to what anthropology and archaeology is all about?
Yes, definitely. There was a professor where I was an undergraduate at University of California, Berkeley, who specialized in the Pacific Islands. And he's
Mhm.
trained as an archaeologist primarily, but he grew up in Hawaii and traveled and worked everywhere in the Pacific. His name is Pat Kirch. He's really quite a famous archaeologist at this point. And he was just incredibly inspirational. And one of the requirements for undergraduates at Berkeley was to do a field school. And there were a lot of options in different places of the world, but I'd taken a Hawaiian ethnohistory class with Pat Kirch and also an archaeology of the Pacific Islands class with him. And I thought, you know what? I really would like to work in that region of the world, but there weren't any field schools per se. So I approached him one day after class and kind of expressed my interest. And he said, well, I'm doing a project in Hawaii on the island of Maui with some graduate students. It's not really a field school, but we'll be excavating all summer. Maybe you'd like to come for part of that. So I showed up and worked with him and his graduate students, and it was pretty transformational, and that totally sealed the deal. So I knew from then on that I wanted to do archaeology, but not only that, archaeology in the Pacific.
Yeah, Pacific archaeology is really fascinating. I think I learned about how fascinating it was a few years ago when I learned about the Polynesian expansion, which is one of the most famous aspects of Polynesian Pacific Island archaeology, and just kind of how amazing it was that people crossed this vast territory, this vast region without modern instruments, just canoes and all of that stuff. So super, super cool stuff. So you kind of answered my second question, which is what drew you to focus on the Pacific Islands? And also you have focused specifically on food and foodways and food cultures. So what brought you to that particular subject matter in regards to the Pacific Islands?
Good question. So I think it's a number of things that all came together. First of all, I love food and I love eating.
Mm.
In my free time, I do lots of cooking and I live on a working farm. And that's also kind of influenced my current research and more kind of theoretical shifts I've had in the last 10 or 15 years as well. So the love of food is one thing, but then I always was really drawn to bones and studying bones and animal remains. So when I started excavating in Maui for the first time, I would just loved picking out all the little fish bones and small animal bones and sorting through the shells and things like that. And so Pat Kirch suggested that as a senior honors thesis, that I study the faunal remains from some of the sites that we were working on, and I did. And again, it was just immediate enjoyment. It kind of put me in a zen place, sorting through all of these things and learning how to identify them. So that's just something I've continued on with from a zooarchaeological approach, and then more recently using ethnoarchaeology, starting with my dissertation research in Fiji.
That's awesome. And I feel like food is really inseparable from culture. When you're talking about pre-modern societies anywhere in the world, their main job was their subsistence. Like how did they feed themselves? I always say when I take people on a tour of our guard site that the people that lived there, their main job was growing food and feeding themselves. And when they got up, today our jobs are either archaeologist or public science communicator or something. But back then, their full-time job was feeding themselves. So it makes a lot of sense why, it's important to study food.
Yeah, it's really just such an integral part of culture, and we take it for granted here in the modern world, where if we need something, we go to the grocery store and we have, literally the world at our fingertips, and there's nothing we can't have out of season, or, just to strike a fancy that we've got about what we feel like eating at any given day. And it's such a different situation from people who are engaged in a subsistence economy and people living in developing areas of the world.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that anytime that you can detect a change either, historically, ethnographically, or in archaeologically in subsistence, that also comes along with a bunch of cultural change as well. And that changes the way that societies work together and develop. So super cool. I really enjoyed reading the research that you published.
Thank you. Yeah, this idea that you can't really divorce food and all of the things that surround food, including environmental factors, it has become a key part of my more recent research in the last few years. And I'm really just trying to look at this idea of nature and culture and how food fits into that, and how it's really both. And I think that when we separate those things, divorces the essence of food, which is, the environment, the soil, the water, the plants and animals that are all part of it, but also the human activities that go into food. What do we consider is food? What's ordinary food? What's not special food? It's everyday food versus feast foods and these kinds of things. The way we use food in a ritual way, all of that is sort of wrapped up in my ideas about the connection between nature and culture and how food situates within that.
Yeah, and a key theme that I was picking up in your work as I was reading is this approach that you refer to as post-humanist to archaeology and anthropology. Could you explain what post-humanist means in regards to how we understand humanity in relation to nature and food and the environment?
So this is a theoretical shift that started around 2010s and 2015, especially with the work of Donna Haraway and also Eduardo Kohn. And these anthropologists start talking about the world beyond human culture, and how if we shift our focus away from essentially just what humans are doing as anthropologists, it enriches the way that we interpret humans and the way that they live in the world in any given context. And I know that sounds really general, and over time, this idea of post-human anthropology has evolved. So more recently, people who do post-human anthropology are looking at things like the interaction between humans and technology and computers and things of that nature. And I'm really frankly not very interested in that. You saw how hard it was for me to get onto this video link. I'm not really very interested in modern technology, but originally posthumanism was looking at the interaction between humans and everything around it. And the analogy that I always use for my students is, so you could take your hand and you could envision that as humanity. But what is it that defines the hand? Is it something inherent about the hand, or should we also look at the space around the hand? And that
Hmm.
also helps us understand what the hand is. And so I know it's kind of a simplistic way to explain it, but we are so much more than just humans. We are connected with everything around us in the world. It sounds a little bit hippified, but it also helps us appreciate our interconnections and think of these things in terms of management and conservation. And for archaeologists, that would also be part of salvage archaeology and interacting with indigenous people who have these long-term heritage situations and who are now our collaborators.
Ready to dig into the past, literally? Join the ARI Public Archaeology Field School this summer and get hands-on experience in real archaeological research. Learn excavation, survey, lab analysis, and even how to share discoveries with the public, all while working alongside professionals in the Ohio River Valley. With small class sizes and a focus on real-world skills, this is your chance to be a part of something bigger, preserving history for future generations. Spots are limited, so visit exploreari.org to apply now and start your journey into archaeology with ARI.
I wanted to ask you about, it's a bit of a broad question, but I think it's an important one to ask. So you focused on the anthropology and archaeology of the Pacific Islands, which, as we've said, is a huge region covering thousands and thousands of square miles of open ocean, occasional archipelagos and isolated islands. So is there anything that connects the foodways of the peoples that populate these disparate island communities to each other? Do they have similar foodways and understandings and relationships to the nature that surrounds them?
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of characteristics that are very similar across the tropical Pacific Islands and including the three areas that have. So typically, that region has been divided up as Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. And if you look at those different culture areas, they're not always conceived of in the exact same way now as they have been for several hundred years, but there are consistencies across the cultures in terms of really important food items, but also the way that they use food. So, kind of stereotypical Pacific Island foods, this includes things like coconuts, bananas, tubers of various kinds, especially yams. And then more recently in prehistory, sweet potatoes were incorporated into the diet. Now, that's kind of an interesting case because the sweet potato actually was domesticated in South America. And so prehistorically, there was some interaction between people in South America and the Polynesians. And then in addition to that, all of these different cultures also have a similar suite of domesticated animals, and the primary domesticated animals are pigs, dogs, and chickens. So as the original colonizing groups spread out across the Pacific, which went from the far west to the east, they carried with them in their canoes this suite of animal and plant resources that forms the basis of their diet. And then they introduce those food groups to every island that they get to. But the way that they use the foods varies slightly, of course, as you would expect, depending on the environment. So when you're on an atoll, for example, which is in case people listening don't know what an atoll is essentially a submerged volcano that results in the fringing reef being left at sea level. And then it creates an area that's habitable, but it's literally at sea level. So people can live there, and Pacific Islanders have inhabited many atolls, but the environment is very resource poor because it's just remnant fringing reef, essentially, and it's mostly sand. There's not a lot of topsoil or anything like that. So many different kinds of plants and animals can't live there long run. So when Pacific Islanders get to different types of islands, they're confronted with different challenges. And so their food packages that they bring with them are adjusted according to environmental variables and then other sort of social issues that arise over time. But you could say that there's a basis of the Pacific Island diet, and that would be the items that I mentioned. And then the way that they use those food items is also somewhat consistent across the region. And one of the important things about food in these cultures is that food is seen as more of a community resource than an individual resource. So when people are eating, they're very concerned not so much with feeding themselves, but making sure that everybody around them is eating well. And so in Fiji, for example, when you're eating and you've sat down to a big formal meal, people will regularly yell out, eat a lot, keep eating, eat until you're fat, eat until you're full, these kinds of things. And so they're always paying attention at they're paying attention to everybody else's plate and how much they're eating the whole time, because the more you eat and essentially the fatter you are, the more healthy and happy you are, and the more cared for you are by the people within the community. So it's very different from the way that we conceive of food and eating, or, we might eat on our own. That's very common now in modern society, just people eating alone. That would never traditionally be done in the Pacific Islands, because eating is inherently a social act and people are keenly attuned to what others are doing. And if you're a good person, then you're really concerned about how well everyone around you is eating.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that, you have this vast region, but because of these common origin points, there's so many linguistic, cultural, religious ties that kind of connect all of these different islands together. I'm curious when it comes to feasting. So I just spoke recently with Dr. Justin Jennings, so completely different region of the globe, but he studies the Wadi people of Peru, and he was telling me that feasting was really important in the sense that they were kind of in a similar way, like they were supposed to eat a lot and drink a lot in a way that had almost ritual significance. It has to do with the preservation of the cosmos by fulfilling this. Do these feasts that you've been describing, do they serve any sort of ritual or religious kind of function as well?
Yes, absolutely. It's a similar situation to what you see in Peru and many other societies, especially complex societies, right? You could really compare the feasting of the Pacific Islanders to other groups that have a good bit of social complexity. So yes, certain foods are used in a ritual sense, and certain foods are considered. The word taboo originally derives from Pacific Island languages, and they use that word all the time. It's kind of a structuring principle within their society. So when something is taboo, it's not so much off limits, but it's sacred and it's treated in a specific way. And feast foods are generally thought of as being sacred and special or taboo. And so when you're having a feast, there are a couple things you want to make sure to do. One of them is you want a diversity of food, so a wide variety of things. Some of those things you might have in everyday meals, but then there are also specialty foods, and they may take something like a yam, which is an everyday food, but it's valued. A yam isn't seen as the way that we think of a lowly like yam or potato in our society. It has a much more importance to Pacific Islanders. And in fact, they love tubers. So potatoes of various kinds. There are many different species of yams and sweet potatoes now and things like that. And they're all sort of honored and remarked upon in ways that are pretty different from the way that we think of these tubers. But anyway, a yam, for example, could be taken and prepared in a way that's somewhat time consuming. It might be grated and mixed with coconut milk and then wrapped in leaves and cooked in an earth oven. And then it's called a pudding. And at that point, this somewhat mundane food is transformed into this specialty food item, and you would serve that at a feast. So a feast not only has a diversity of foods, but it also has specialty foods and other specialty foods that they might have at feast. And this is true in ancient prehistory and also in modern times, are things like turtles. The pig is probably the ultimate specialty food. It's very fatty. And so special foods are fatty foods. There's this Hawaiian proverb that says something about a prosperous eater has a shiny, greasy mouth because they've been eating fatty foods. And that's really sort of the ideal for an exciting feast. And then the other thing you want at a feast is to make sure that everyone who's eating is completely satiated to the point that they can barely sit up, that they've eaten so much that not only do they have their fill, but they've eaten beyond that point. So you want to exceed expectations with the feast. And there are a lot of ethno-historical records of feasts on a lot of different islands where you literally see piles of turtles or piles of pigs and piles of fish all laid out. And then there's usually someone in the village who will announce what each person has brought to the feast. So all of this builds prestige, and there's a kind of competition going on in the background as well.
And at these feasts, so you mentioned these specialty items, dare I say luxury items, I'm not sure if that's a good word to use. Did everyone have equal access to these specific food items, or is there a bit of a hierarchy? Is there a hierarchy in the way that these Pacific Islanders, Fijians, Hawaiians feast?
There's definitely a hierarchy. So not everyone gets equal access to everything. And usually the way that it works is that the elders who are the elder men in the village, that would include the chief and his sort of eldest son and his advisors and people of rank. The men and the high-ranked people would go first. They would eat first. And there's also gender differentiation in terms of where people eat physically. So what you see in most feasts across the tropical Pacific is you see the men sitting together eating. And then when the men have finished eating and they've had their fill, then the women and the children will eat. So it sounds a little upsetting to a lot of Westerners, but essentially the women and the kids get the leftovers. As a caveat, though, because there's so much abundance, you don't see people moping like, oh, I had to eat the leftovers at the feast. I only got a turtle fragment or something like that.
Right.
Everyone eats well, and there's always an abundance. And that's part of the duty, too, of the people orchestrating the feast, is to make sure that everyone is well fed.
And how often would these feasts? I mean, I would imagine they're still conducted in a similar way, at least with some continuity to the way that they've been done in the past. And we can tease that out as well, kind of how these food traditions have changed throughout time. But how often were these feasts held? What was this, a once a year kind of an occasion? Was there certain cosmic alignments or weddings or?
Yes, absolutely. So feasts would be somewhat irregular in the sense that they didn't happen every day, but there are lots of special events that need to be marked with these ritual gatherings and an abundance of food. And so that would be anything like weddings, funerals, the birth of a first child in a family, birthdays for people of rank, the installment of a chief, or, as you said, certain seasonal or events like the transition from the dry season to the wet season or something like that, or the harvest season. So feasts happened irregularly, but throughout the year on a ritual calendar. And then depending on things going on, like I said, deaths and marriages and things of that nature. So everyday foods were eaten and structured like mini feasts in Fiji and in islands like Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and much of Polynesia. So the same kinds of rules would apply to eating that applied to the feast, where the men and the people of rank would eat first, and then the women and the kids would eat second. But it would just not include that great diversity and the public display of the luxury food items.
Just to kind of ask a kind of a general question, but one I'm interested in, at least anthropologic kind of sense. So can we say that these Pacific Islanders, when it comes to subsistence, are purely agriculturalists, or are they purely fishers? Are they purely hunter-gatherers? Or kind of, because we've been mentioning a lot of different foods, how does this all blend together in terms of how these Pacific communities fed themselves?
Good question. So they're agriculturalists, and depending on what island you're looking at, because when we talk about the tropical Pacific and those three cultural regions, Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, we're talking literally about thousands of islands, right? So there is some diversity across the board. But in general, the people who showed up and initially colonized all of those islands, they were agriculturalists. So they're coming with domesticated plants and animals. And how sort of intensive the level of agriculture is depends on the context. But in many islands, they had irrigated field systems and certain kinds of, again, going back to tubers, things like taro often grow best in an irrigated agricultural field. So those kinds of things would have required an intensive level of agriculture. But at the same time, people had a house garden, which is like a small garden that would be close to the house. And you would have sort of everyday foods that the whole family would eat. And that might include things like bananas, or nowadays they have chili peppers, and they might have a citrus tree and avocados or something in their house garden. Those aren't indigenous foods necessarily, but those are the kinds of things they keep on hand and close by. So they'll have an extensive agricultural field that's owned by the family and then passed down through the ranks and through generations. And then they keep a house garden. And then in addition to that, most of the islands have a very intensive fishing culture. And for the most part, men and women fish. But in the Central Pacific and throughout Polynesia, it's generally the women that fish every day, and they fish in the inshore area. So that's the littoral zone where the sea meets the edge of the land, and you expect tide pools and things like that. And then islands that have a fringing reef, the female gendered labor area is also on the inshore area inside the reef, and that's where you see things like smaller fish. And so that affects the type of fishing that people do. Women usually fish with small hooks and hand lines, or more commonly with nets. And sometimes they'll use big nets, sometimes they'll use small scoop nets and things like that. The kids also help fishing in that inshore area. And then they also collect shellfish. So they get their bony fish and shellfish in the inshore area. They may also collect things like seaweed and certain plants that go along with that fishing culture. And then the men fish offshore. And so they're fishing from boats, usually trolling. And it's a whole different set of technologies that are used in the offshore area versus inshore. So they've got their intensive agriculture, their house gardens, and then they fish regularly. And then in addition to that, they do some hunting and gathering where people will go into the bush and they'll get birds. They'll collect wild and feral plants and animals and things like that. A lot of people across the tropical Pacific love to eat bats. And so the bats are out there in the forested area, and that's something that they'll hunt regularly. But because of the distance between the island and the island's distance from mainland, most of the islands don't have large mammals for hunting. Nowadays, they've been introduced, so you see cows and goats and things like that on a lot of the tropical Pacific islands, but that's not something that would have been there in prehistoric times.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So I'm curious, I guess this would also depend possibly seasonally or even geographically, but so if I was a average Pacific Islander and I was about to start my day, would the tasks that I was going to do in regards to subsistence, is it a mix of fishing, of agriculture? So do I start my day in my garden and then do I go fish? Or is there a division of labor in the sense that you have fishers, you have a fisher family, and then you have an agricultural family, or is it a blend?
It's both. Most people will have pigs that they keep in a pen outside of the village. And so if you are the man of the household and you're married, you have a family, most likely your day would begin with you going to the pig pen and feeding scraps to the pigs. The men go out most mornings and they actually sing to their pigs, and they make sure that their pigs recognize their voice. So when the owner of the pigs calls, the pigs will come, which is great in times of feeding, but also when you're ready to club them over the head and eat them for a feast or a special occasion.
Mhm.
So all the pigs know their owners, and if they get out, which they do often because pigs are really wily characters, then the owner can easily kind of get them back in and call them in. So you're the head of the household. Your day begins by going and feeding the pigs. And then you would probably go to your garden. And in previous years, I've taken dozens of students to Fiji, and they've done small ethnographic projects that can usually be done in a month or so. And one of the things I've had students do is track people and how they spend their time during the day. And as it turns out, a lot of the time that men spend in their gardens, they're actually napping. And that isn't to say that they are lazy, which of course they are not. But it's like their guy time. And sometimes they'll take their
Mm.
sons with them, and they'll spend a long chunk of the day working in the garden and weeding, planting, harvesting, taking what they need for the day. They usually have several different crops going at one time, so they can always bring stuff into the village and into the house to eat. But there are more intensive times when everyone comes together to help with the harvest and help with clearing the fields and things like that. So for the men, it's mostly tending the pigs and working in the garden, sometimes napping, sometimes snacking. And then for the women, again, if they're married, they will usually get a small fist together. Might be heating up some tea or coffee or something like that, and some leftover tubers from the night before. And then oftentimes the women will start cooking for a bigger second meal of the day, a kind of supper, and then they'll go out fishing on the reef. And that could be an hour or it could be 5 hours, depending on the kind of fishing they're doing and depending on the tides and the moon phase and the fish that are being targeted. And then the women will go back to the house and do kind of typical domestic tasks of cooking and cleaning and looking after the little kids and things of that nature. So to answer your question about how the day goes for the average person, it depends on your gender, your age, whether or not you're married, if you're providing for a
Mm.
household. And another interesting thing that I found working with Fijians in particular is that the kids work. They're not a leisure class. And so when they're not in school, they are usually helping their mothers and their sisters get food, cook food, sometimes even clean up. But they're also doing kid things on the side, playing, and they love rugby and soccer and things like that. So they're always busy. And a lot of the time they're actually helping contribute to the food getting that's going on in the house.
Yeah, and taken all together, it seems like it's a very robust, nutritious diet that these people, it seems for generations, have been kind of partaking in. Is that fair to say?
It is definitely. It's a very healthy diet. I think this is probably true of most island cultures that have a subsistence system. They are very healthy. Their teeth are beautiful. They have strong bones and strong bodies because they engage in physical labor. I've worked with many elder women who have been out fishing in their 80s, and they're hauling these huge nets around on their backs and going out into the water and doing all kinds of activities, that we typically wouldn't associate with elderly women in our culture. I've done some studies with colleagues where we've looked at health and obesity and things of that nature. And often the women in these traditional villages that are engaged in the subsistence economy live longer they're much healthier. They have large body sizes because of the cultural aesthetic for large bodies, but they don't have diabetes as frequently as you see in Western cultures, and they have fewer cancers and things like that. So there's definitely advantages to this lifestyle, and because the environments are so rich, you really don't see people going hungry.
Ready to dig into discovery? Join the Archaeological Research Institute with a student or family membership. Whether you're a junior explorer, apprentice archaeologist, college researcher, or a part of the family expedition team, you'll enjoy hands-on experiences, exclusive passes, and a Field Notes magazine packed with stories and activities. Memberships start at just $25, and every level helps support real archaeology in your community. Join today and start exploring at the Archaeological Research Institute.
I wanted to ask you, so we mentioned the changes through food traditions through time, specifically as you can tell through either ethnographic accounts or archaeological accounts. So I know that this is a broad question, but what are the main kind of differences when it comes to the diet of a Pacific Islander today versus, let's say, 1,000 years ago, or at least before prehistoric or pre-modern times?
In general, if you look at the tropical Pacific Islands, you could divide the population up into people who live in the cities and then people who live in more remote villages. And my research has been mostly with the people in the remote villages because I'm interested in doing ethnoarchaeology, where I investigate how they're living now and how that might have compared to how they lived thousands of years ago. So I'll talk about that situation. The people in the cities are pretty much like people in cities anywhere who shop at grocery stores, and they have McDonald's and Starbucks, and they have many of the health problems of modern Western civilization that go along with that. But in the more traditional settings, in the more remote villages, the people are living in a very different way. And so they have been somewhat isolated from some of those typical health problems, but as time goes on, they're more and more susceptible to it. And in part, especially in the traditional Central Pacific islands like Fiji and Tonga, the demographic structure is breaking down. And not surprisingly, young people don't actually want to stay in those villages. And because of that, the social structures are failing, and things are changing quite drastically. And I would be surprised if 100 years from now, there's even people living traditionally as they are now. So if you look at the subsistence economies, they're quite similar in many ways to what people have been doing for thousands of years with the farming, the animal domestication, the fishing, and that sort of thing. But more and more people are relying on Western foods. Part of it happens as a result of necessity, and another part of it is the exotic nature of these introduced foods being kind of interesting and coming in shiny packages and cans, and the marketing that goes along with it. So those foods that are non-traditional are exciting to people. A lot of them they want to consume, and then others they reject outright. So what I'm seeing is most islands have small stores where people can purchase canned goods, coffee, fishing line, flip-flops, the occasional bolt of fabric or something like that. And if they have an income of some kind, then they want to buy those things because those exotic items have actually turned into prestige goods. So more and more, when people are having a feast for a funeral or a wedding, you will see ramen presented as a specialty luxury food. And that's not because it tastes delicious to everyone, but because it's interesting and it's foreign and it costs money. So it has a different value than, when we think about ramen being like a college kid's food, and could get a pack for $1 or something like that. Well, it has a very different meaning in this traditional context. So more and more people are eating introduced foods and Western foods, and it is causing their traditional diets to shift quite a bit, and it's having health impacts as well. And people are very susceptible to Western marketing, especially when they come from a culture where they haven't previously been exposed to it. And it's a form of kind of naivete. And I don't say that in a disparaging way. It's just that if you haven't lived a life where you're surrounded by television and lots of images and social media and news and all of the stuff that goes along with Western cultures in the modern world, when you're first exposed to those things, they can be very powerful. So anthropologists have actually looked at how this has worked in Fiji specifically. And there's an anthropologist who does a lot of medical anthropology. Her name is Annie Becker. And she looked at the way that when television was first introduced to these remote villages in Fiji, it created this epidemic of anorexia and bulimia, where previously this had never existed. I mean, the whole concept of people eating food and throwing it up or avoiding food and not eating and starving themselves is so completely foreign to anything a Pacific Islander would normally even imagine. That just does not fit in their worldview. But within literally a year or two of being exposed to Western media and the body images that typically come with that being sort of thin and very different from traditional Fijian bodies, she immediately saw this shift in young women where they were becoming very unhealthy in their relationship with food.
That's really fascinating. It's really interesting to see how contact, which, contact isn't something that happened like 200 years ago. It's still ongoing, a contact between different cultures. And that's, I think you illustrated that really well with kind of new exposure to Western culture and how that can impact. Seems pretty negatively, I think maybe it's fair to say. And I also wonder with other trends of the modern day, specifically climate change, how that might also affect subsistence as well, especially with, you mentioned these atolls, which are literally at sea level, how that might affect access to food and utilization of traditional foodways. So
yeah, there are a number of situations that I've experienced where extreme weather events have impacted people, especially in Fiji. And one of the ones that I've written about is a drought that happened in the early 2000s. And actually, the very first evidence of coral bleaching in Fiji happened in 2000 and 2001. So there are many groups of marine biologists that are monitoring the reefs there because they're rich and unique and quite extensive. So seeing that coral bleaching as a result of warmer oceans and other negative micronutrients and things like that coming into the marine system was a big deal the first time it was documented in Fiji. But I could actually see the impact of that during a drought in 2003 when I was working in the Central Lao group on the island of Niau. And this island it's a tiny island. It's only about 4 miles across. And there were around 300 people that lived there when I was doing my research there in the 2000s. And there was no running water or electricity. Few people had generators, but they weren't run regularly because you have to buy fuel to run the generators. So in general, people are kind of living off the grid and in very traditional ways. But during this drought, people ran out of water. And so they resorted to drinking coconut water, which, of course, is free and readily available and delicious and healthy. So that wasn't such a big deal. But they do have cisterns, and they reserved the water in their cisterns for drinking kava, which is a traditional narcotic that they use for certain ceremonies and things like that. So they had that on hold, the water. There wasn't any water for washing clothes or taking showers or anything like that. So people were bathing in the sea taking sea baths instead of with fresh water. But then it also affected their food supply because the bleaching had immediate impacts on the availability of fish in the littoral zone in that inshore area. And so they didn't have the abundance that they were used to. And they started shark fishing, which was very unusual because a lot of Fijians have supernatural connections with sharks. It's a kind of family totem where they consider the shark to be what we call family god of sorts. And even though most of these Fijians are Christian, they still have connections to their traditional religious and cosmological ideas. So many people practice shark avoidance. They won't eat shark. But during this drought in 2003, they started fishing for shark to supplement the diet. And people started vying for seats on these boats, these little fiberglass boats with an outboard engine that would go out to catch sharks. And it just created a lot of social disruption. And they started treating certain food items in new and anthropologically interesting ways. But it was also stressful for them. So there was a lot of social stress as a result. So yes, absolutely. Islands are highly susceptible to extreme weather events, and anthropologists and archaeologists who work on islands are very aware of that. And while these are interesting test cases, I think they also provide lessons for the broader world in terms of, when things don't go the way we want, what we might expect to see when societies are challenged.
It seems like these two things that we've been talking about, so exposure to Western media or Western culture and how that kind of affects societies, and then extreme weather events and climate change almost presents an existential threat to these traditional ways of being, of subsistence. And you kind of mentioned earlier, you're doubtful in 100 years that there will be many people kind of practicing these. Is there anything else that you wanted to draw attention to or kind of talk about in regards to contemporary Pacific Islander issues under?
Well, kind of bringing it back to archaeology, cultural heritage is a big issue, and it's part of this. So, of course, you know this, and anthropologists have spent quite some time looking into the connection between the diversity of cultures, linguistic diversity, and then environmental diversity, and how all of these things are interwoven. And when you see the loss of one of them, the others go as well. So we know the lessons from anthropology and archaeology are it behooves us to foster this cultural diversity and the continuation of certain cultural traditions and languages and things of that nature. There are a lot of benefits for local people from that. So, in terms of the way that Pacific Islanders may be looking at archaeology as their heritage, I think that there's a lot that archaeologists can offer to that conversation, and also vice versa, where the interaction with Native peoples helps us to understand the way that they see their past and how they want to use that past in the future. But for me personally, working in the tropical Pacific Islands and engaging with living people all the time has greatly enriched my archaeological research. And I know we've mostly been talking about the modern world, but there's it's an almost seamless connection between the way that people live in the present and the way that the past also makes up their heritage and their culture. And we kind of take these things for granted, or we don't even understand them because we don't have that connection all the time here. But working with Polynesians has completely changed the way that I think about archaeology, and I think about cultural heritage, and I think of it as, lessons that these people are teaching me. They're like my teachers, and I'm not there as an archaeologist to tell them about their past. There are certainly scientific things that they can learn about the past from my research, but it's more about me learning from them about their past. And there have been many instances for me personally where I haven't understood something that I've found archaeologically, and the native people have helped me understand that. So doing ethnoarchaeology is, I just can't actually imagine doing archaeology in the Pacific without that ethnographic component, although that's probably much more common. Well, it definitely is much more common than doing ethnoarchaeology.
Yeah, and that approach is also, I think, really important in the broader context of American archaeology in general. So when it comes to Fort Ancient culture groups, we as archaeologists can find out what we can from the materials and the context and the artifacts themselves. But we're missing a really important part of the picture if we're not also consulting descendant communities and asking them what they want to know about data that we're going through and stuff like that. So I think that's really important. And I also wanted to ask you, so we've kind of been alluding to a concept that appeared in your paper that you refer to as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. And is that kind of what you're referring to when you're talking about this traditional way of coexistence with nature and kind of possibly like a post-humanist way of understanding people and their place, and not people without, outside their context?
Yes, definitely. I think traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, exemplifies that blurring of nature and culture. And I think that also fits nicely with the indigenous Pacific Islander worldview, because if you think about it, these people, for most of their history, did not have widespread written language. That means that oral history and storytelling was the primary mode of passing on information, both historical, mythical, and of course, other kinds of cultural information. But it creates a really interesting situation where we know from the oral traditions of indigenous Pacific Islanders that they can trace their genealogies back through ancestors and individuals. And if you're talking to the right person, especially a chiefly person or someone that holds this kind of knowledge, which is not everyone in society, but certain individuals do, then they can actually tell you about this supernatural collective entanglement between humans, certain individuals, and then many aspects of the environment, like the origin of the land and the sea and the creatures that are involved with that, and how these kind of supernatural elements could be embodied in a stone or in a shark or in some kind of tree that's associated with certain medicinal properties, or chiefly line or something like that. So we refer to traditional ecological knowledge, and that is related to this as well. And they use this to structure the way that they engage in the environment. It's knowledge that's passed down through family lines about how to use the environment, how to extract what you need. There is some aspect of conservation, or probably more accurately, management, involved with the TEK. You really don't see people they're not environmental social justice warriors, that sort of thing. They view the environment as something associated with them that they care for, but also for extraction. So it's useful, and it's not just about conservation. It's more about management and how they use it. But that's also connected with ancient traditional gods and deities and spirits and ancestors. And there's kind of a continuous line that connects all of those things. And so when I talk to people about the way that they use resources, there's something that's so rich in their interpretation that isn't just clean cut, material quantifiable. And it really just takes these stories and talking to people to figure that out.
Yeah, and you mentioned mythological beings and spirits and gods, and that actually is kind of what I wanted to talk to you about next. So kind of switching, not necessarily discussing contemporary culture, but maybe more an archaeological context. Roles do, spirit, gods, and ancestral beings play in kind of connecting humans to the land and to the sea and to their food themselves and kind of.
That's a big question.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's a great question, but it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
So again, all of this is context dependent, where you are, what island you're on, and who you're talking to. But in my experience, it's the elder people and often people of some rank who are entrusted with this information that is about their ancestral spiritual ideas. And it's sort of in conflict with their current Christian ideals, but they are okay with that in a way that you don't see so much in the Western world. They accept that, for example, if you talk to Fijians, and they tell tourists this too in the cities, but they say it in the villages as well, like, oh, we used to be cannibals. We used to worship war gods and eat people, but now we're Methodist and we don't do that. And and so they say it lightly, but they also realize that that is part of their heritage, and certain people in the village will know why they did that, and they'll have stories about that. And the stories could be largely historical, or they may be more mythical and difficult to connect to actual realistic historical things that have happened. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question entirely.
No, that's okay. I guess it's just a very broad question about how like religious beliefs about spirits and gods and ancestors kind of relate to how they imagine their foodways and things like this. And I guess something that came to mind while you were talking about it is I recently kind of read an account of Captain Cook's voyages, specifically around Hawaii, and how his arrival in the archipelago kind of coincided with this festival. I don't remember specifically the deity that they kind of arrived as, but
Lono.
how that kind of
Lono.
yeah, which I always find really interesting. And then obviously he returned, and then they realized that he wasn't the god, and that's kind of why they were not very happy with him and not very pleased.
That is such a great story. When
I know it
teach
really
a
is.
Pacific Island class about the people of the Pacific Island, I always tell my students about this because it's historically very interesting and really important in terms of culture change and the opening of colonial population coming into Hawaii. But it's also really bizarre and interesting at the same time, because I think that there are coincidental things that happen that are almost unexplainable because of the timing of Captain Cook's arrival. And as you mentioned, it was during the Makihiki festival, which is the annual ritual alteration between Lono, the somewhat peaceful agricultural god, and then Ku, who is the war god. And I think, based on my reading and understanding of what happened, that they did think that Captain Cook was associated with Lono, or he was a kind of avatar or earthly representation of Lono. He was treated the same way the Lono image was treated every year during that ritual cycle when it would be carried around the big island of Hawaii. But then when he came back, that's where it gets really interesting. I mean, it's an unfortunate story because Captain Cook is killed, obviously, spoiler alert, but the way that he's treated after they kill him is also very odd and surprising, because many of the Hawaiians who are on shore and who witnessed his demise are devastated when they see him drop and they see him die. And they cry, and some of them are tearing at their clothes and hair, and they're throwing themselves on the ground, and they're chanting Orono, Orono, like maybe they didn't think he could die because he was a god. And then the way that he was treated, the burial treatment of Captain Cook, was also the way that they would treat burial of a high priest or a chief or something like that. So it's a really interesting and bizarre story for that reason. But
So I wanted to ask you, so kind of in a similar vein, so that's like an ethnographic historic account. Is that do you draw on similar sources of kind of first contact in regards to these island communities, or are you focusing more on contemporary and archaeology data?
it's all of that. I use all of that information. So the ethno-historical accounts, the explorer accounts are really useful. There was a U.S. exploring expedition under Captain Wilkes in the 1800s, I believe. And he went not just to Fiji, but to many other islands. And he has beautiful accounts, writings as well as pictures and maps and things like that. So this kind of information is really very useful for me. Of course, we know that some of it is sensationalized in the way that people are described, but almost all of that can be tested archaeologically. And so with the case of, say, Fijians being cannibals, not only do Fijians themselves claim that they were, and of course the records of the explorers also depict some pretty gruesome cannibal ceremonies and some that aren't especially gruesome. They're just treated like regular feasts, except that there's a human as well as pigs and turtles and dogs and other things. So there's that line of evidence. But then archaeologically, there's very good evidence that people were cannibalized prehistorically in Fiji. And I've worked with colleagues to study that specific question. And so looking at the human remains from middens and comparing those remains to the butchered remains of pigs and dogs, we were able to show that they most likely were eating humans, but it wasn't a gastronomic cannibalism. It wasn't because they were hungry. It was to obtain their mana or supernatural efficacy that made warriors or certain individuals powerful. And that's actually something that I've been writing about in a book that I've collaborated on with a couple of colleagues that we just submitted to Cambridge for one of their series called Elements in Food Archaeology. And I was writing about an archaeological site that I excavated back in, I think it was 2013. And it was a large mound not far from the shoreline. So it was primarily sand, a couple meters tall, but about 5 times the size of a regular mound that people would build a normal house on. And so we excavated a number of units across the top of it. And right in the middle, we encountered a huge earth oven. A earth oven that was about 5 feet long and several feet deep. So again, it's about 3 or 4 times the size of a regular earth oven that you would put a big pig in. And the dates that we got for the site come right around like the AD 0 into 200 and that area. And in the earth oven, there were no bones. It was just charcoal and lenses of ash and things like that, and fire-cracked rock. But it had the typical earth oven scoop shape, and it was exactly like earth ovens that I've documented from the modern sites and ancient sites going back thousands of years. So it was somewhat perplexing, and one of the village elders came to us and said, "Oh, well, this is the mound of a priest. There was a priest's house here and a temple in prehistoric times, and we have stories that we know about this place." And they knew of course, the family line where the land was connected, and they said, "Well, that's obviously a cannibal oven." So we were never able to prove that it was used to cook humans in, but in prehistory, there was nothing big enough to go in that oven other than a human. There were no cattle at that time on the island. It was just pigs, dogs, and chickens. And it was very unusual and clearly associated with ritual. And then there were other aspects of the site that we were able to piece together that made us think it was indeed a priest's house or some kind of temple. site where rituals were conducted.
So we're getting a little bit over an hour, so I want to respect your time. So we'll wrap up just in a few more minutes. But I did want to ask you, so with this kind of behavior of cannibalistic, ritualistic eating, does this coincide with times of, so you said it wasn't for food, it wasn't for sustenance, it was more for kind of a ritualistic of you're taking the ability and the strength of your foe or your captive. Does this kind of occur during times of war or times where there's possibly more competition for resources? Or is this a more regular kind of just occurrence, maybe on a yearly basis?
It was probably both. I think
Hmm.
cannibalism was practiced widely in the Pacific Islands in pre-contact times, but not frequently.
Hmm.
And I think I've made the case in publications before looking at certain sites that some of the potentially cannibalized remains in the middens represent acts of ancestor veneration and not gastronomic need. So it might be the case that your father dies, and before you bury him in your house in the floor, you cut off a small chunk of meat, maybe from the thigh or something like that, and it's ritually consumed. So
Hmm.
that kind of cannibalism, I think, has been around for a long time and it's been widespread, and there is archaeological evidence for that. And then the second kind of cannibalism that you just described does also occur in many Pacific Islands at times of resource stress, as would be expected. So they had both, but very different
Gotcha.
meanings for each one, I think.
Yeah. So just kind of in conclusion, I'm curious, Dr. Jones, where are you going to be focusing your future research, kind of just in the immediate future? So are you you mentioned that you've got a forthcoming book, which I'm excited to see and to read. Hopefully, it gets published soon. But so what else are you up to right now?
So I have a few loose ends of things I need to publish on from the Fiji work that I'd done over the last 20 years. I'm always kind of chipping away at that in my free time. But in addition to that, starting in 2015, I started excavating an archaeological site in New Richmond, Ohio, a lot closer to home. And this was in association with my husband, who is a historian and also a colleague of ours at Northern Kentucky University who used to run the public history program. And the three of us started an archival and excavation project at a place called the Parker Academy that's in New Richmond. And this is a really interesting historical archaeology project. And we got access to a huge archive of information about the family that ran this school. And we believe that this was the first co-educational and multiracial school anywhere in the US. So there's a lot that we need to say about the work that we've been doing there for a while. We've had some NSF funding and many years of excavation and student research, but we haven't published anything significant on that. And I need to get to that. So that's going to be my next area of focus once the Fiji book is published.
Gotcha. And I hope we'll get a chance to discuss your findings at the Parker Academy. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the interview, you gave a talk earlier at our office about your findings, and it's really interesting. Super excited to see what comes from that. But Dr. Jones, I just want to thank you for your time being here today and sitting down and talking with me about this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lee.